Okay, so how do you determine whether the graph I'm sorry, the objective is to write equations of sine and cosine functions given a graph. There could be vertical translations, so we want to just vertical shifts. I mean, we want to go through the steps basic by basic. So remember that a sine or cosine function in general is y equals some number a, we'll go with sine, b theta, sometimes theta is x, plus some number k. K could be positive or negative. So that's the general equation. So what do we need to know? What does the graph need to tell us in order to write these functions? Well, the first thing you need to know is whether it is sine or cosine. And then you also need to know whether it's a positive or negative function. So remember, to know the sine pattern was 0 with no shift. It was 0. I'm sorry, I want to type on here. 0, then max 0, min, oh Jesus, 0 max, 0 min, 0. So that was the basic pattern for sine, because it comes from, basically it comes from the unit circle. When we look at the unit circle, where's the unit circle? I had it put somewhere. There. Remember, if I just use the 4 points on the axes, I'm going to just say, okay, sine is the y value at each of those. Well, the first y value at this point here, where we always have our initial side, is 0. And then we travel up to the top, the positive y-axis, the sine is 1, which is the maximum if the radius of the unit circle is 1 unit. And then 0, and then min, which would be -1, which is the lowest it's going to go, and then 0. So and that pattern just would keep repeating no matter how many times you go around. So that's where we got the pattern. And the same thing works for cosine. Now the cosine starts at 1, which would be the max, goes to 0, min, 0, max. So when we do cosine, we use the opposite pattern. It would be max, 0, min, 0, max. Now don't forget, if a is negative, that number in front, this number a, is negative, that a tells us two things. It tells us whether it's reflected over the y-axis. A negative function always reflects over the x-axis, and it also tells us that a, remember, tells us the amplitude. So we're talking about the value of the sine. If a is negative, the max and min switch. The max and min switch. So the first thing you want to do is figure out whether this is sine or cosine. How do I do that? Well, look at the beginning. 0. Now remember, if there's a vertical shift, it's not going to start at 0, but it's going to, well, let's look at it. So let's look at the y-axis. Always look at the y-axis. This one starts at 0, 0, 0. It doesn't start at 0 max, so we're going to say this is a sine function. Whereas this one starts below the y-axis. I keep saying that backwards, below the x-axis. So this is most likely cosine. So let's now look at whether this is a positive or negative sine function. Well, we go 0, then we go up. It looks like that's 3. Then 0, then it goes down and it ends at pi. So that looks like it's a sine function with a of 3, amplitude of 3, and a is positive 3. So amplitude is 3, and so this is sine, and a equals positive 3, positive sine. Okay, and then this one we said was cosine. And we're thinking, since it starts at a negative value, a must be negative. If it started here at 1 and went to 0, then min, then 0, back up to 1, then it would be positive. But this goes from negative 1 to 0 to positive 1 to 0 to negative 1. So this is A is, and it looks like it's negative 1. Looks like the amplitude is 1. Okay, so you need your amplitude. You need to know whether it's sine or cosine and positive or negative. Once you know the amplitude and whether it's positive or negative, you know whether A is positive or negative. A lot of you were missing that. That was one of the main things you guys missed on the lesson quiz from the previous week. So just remember to always look for that negative A. So go ahead and stop the video and try these two. Tell me the function is sine or cosine and whether A is positive or negative. And you can tell me the value of A. Okay, so this one does not start at 0. Remember, if it shifts, it's going to be different. We're going to look at shifted ones in a minute. So this one is starting at 4. So I'm going to say this is cosine. Cosine, it goes 4, 0, negative 4, 0, 4. So it looks like my A is 4, and it's positive because we're starting at positive 4 there. So that's going to be a positive. So we have part of our, really we know y, so far we know y equals 4 cosine. Remember, we got to figure out b and k yet, if we kept going. Okay, so this one starts at 0, so that means it's sine. And it goes down to 1, so A must be negative 1. So this one, the beginning of my equation would be y equals negative sine. Then you'd have to solve for b, which we're going to do next, and get k. No, we're not going to do that next. We're going to do the midline. Okay, how do I determine the amplitude and the value of A? Well, we kind of already did that. Determine the equation of the midline. So if you've had a vertical shift, you're going to have to figure out what is the midline, and then go from there to determine whether it's sine or cosine. Find the blah 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 amplitude. Count the number of units from the midline. Well, this midline is y equals 0. The amplitude, if I just count up from there, is just 1. And it's positive, so A is positive 1. Count the number of units from the midline to the max, and that is the amplitude. The value of A depends on whether the graph is positive or negative. Check the pattern. So let me type, because this just isn't working. Positive or negative. Or negative. Okay, so if it's negative, don't forget to make that a negative when you write the equation. This one starts at 2 and then goes down to 0. But in between there, you must have crossed that midline. So the midline on this one looks like it's 1. Since it starts at 2 and then it goes down here, we don't have the midline written there, but the midline would be right in there. Let's see if I can draw it. Kinda. I'm gonna go this way. No, I can't draw. Sorry. But you can imagine there's a line there. Well, that tells me the midline is 1, so y equals 1. Y equals 1. Well, what is the amplitude then? If this is the midline right here, oh shoot, I want a line there. If that's the midline, the amplitude is the distance from the midline to the maximum, which is 1 unit. So amplitude is 1. And this is a positive function, so A is again 1. Why is it positive? Is it positive? 0, so max, 0, min, 0, max. Yeah, it's positive. If it started down here and went up, then it would be a negative function. And in your examples, I believe I did give you one that's a negative function, so be aware of that. Yeah, one of these is negative. So stop the video, practice, and then come back. Alright, so for the first try it, the midline is still y equals 0. That one has not shifted. But, so I start at 0, 0, and I go down first. So this is a negative sine function. Okay, I'm just going to say sine, just because we need to get used to saying whether it's sine or cosine. And why is it sine? Because it starts at the midline. It doesn't start above or below the midline. So that's why it's important to be able to pick out the midline. The amplitude is the distance from there to the maximum, which is 1, so A is 1. This one doesn't start at the x-axis, and it doesn't start, this is obviously the max because it's going down here. So let's look. It must cross the midline somewhere between here and here, and that midline is right there in between, right? Pretend that's a straight line. So let's see, the max is -1, then it goes to -2, then it goes to -3, back to -2, and back to -1. Well, this is cosine, right? Max, midline, min, midline, max. So the midline for this one is y equals -2. The amplitude, well, the difference between the midline and the max is just 1. But since it's going, actually no, it's positive. 0, it starts at, yeah, it's following the positive pattern. Max, 0, min, 0, max. So that's positive. So I lied. Oh yeah, that was negative. I got that wrong. That's negative because we went down first. You guys probably stopped the video and started screaming at me. Sorry. Okay, next let's add in finding the period. So now let's go back and do everything we've already done for these examples. Is this sine or cosine? Well, here's the midline, and it does not start on the midline, so it's got to be cosine. And then let's get the A. Is this a positive or negative cosine? So it goes from minimum to the midline, 0, to the max, back to 0 to the midline. So this is a negative. A is negative, and A is negative what? What is that? 1. -1. A is -1. Okay, and we know it's cosine. Now, how do you figure out the period? Well, remember, it's cosine, so it's got to go 0, or I'm sorry, min, 0, max, 0, min. So min, 0, max, 0, min. That period ended at 2 pi. Once you go through one cycle, that gives you the period. And I'm going to let's fill this in up here, and then we'll show you how to get B. Starting on the y-axis, trace through one cycle of the pattern. One cycle of the pattern. So this would have been min, 0, max, 0, min. The x value after one cycle is the period. So the period here was 2 pi. To solve for B, okay, so solving for B, we have to remember that the equation for, or the formula, set the period equal to that formula, which was 2 pi over B. I'm going to write it. 2 pi over B, and then solve for B. So in this case, we're going to set the period, which is 2 pi, equal to 2 pi over B. Well, let's see. I'm going to multiply both sides by B, and that'll give me 2 pi B on this side equals 2 pi. So it looks like these are going to cancel out, and B is just 1. So B is 1. Now this, remember, was a negative A value. So when I write this out, I'm going to have to remember to put that negative A value in front, and then B goes in front of the cosine. So in other words, there's no transformation on this one. So this is going to be y equals negative, you don't have to write the 1, cosine, and since B is 1, I don't have to write that one either, cosine theta, and there's no transformation, vertical shift, so you just leave it. So y equals negative cosine theta. The second one, again, what is this, sine or cosine? Well, let's see, the midline is right here, and it starts on the midline, so that's going to be sine. and it goes up, so this is positive. What is that? That's 2, so this must be 4. So the amplitude is 4, so that means A is 4. Okay, and then period, 0, max, 0, min, 0. Well, I have to kind of look at the Q's. If this is pi over 4, I'm going to double that to get the period, so I'm going to say the period is pi over 2. And then use that to get B. So pi over 2 equals 2 pi over B. Cross multiply, so we can, I'm going to say B times pi equals 4 pi. The pi's cross out and B is 4. And again, since my midline was 1, I can just write the equation. Y equals A was 4 and B is 4. 4 sine 4 theta. Okay, now let's put it all together. Oh, first try it. Okay, stop the video and try it. Alright, so this one, again, the midline is 1, and the first point is on the midline, so we're talking about sine. A is 1, and it's a negative because it's going down first, so A is negative 1. Period, 0, min, 0, max, 0. 1, 2, 3, 4 pi over 4, so that's going to be pi. So pi is 2 pi over B. So these just cancel out. That's 1. So B is 2. 2. And then this one is, the midline is not the axis, so this midline is right here. I do not start on the midline, so it must be cosine. And A, let's see, these are going by 1, so A is 1, and it's a positive because it starts at the max, so A is 1. The period, max, 0, min, 0, max, that must be pi since halfway was, 2 pi since halfway was pi. We already did this one, so we know B is 1. Okay, so this would be 1 cosine 1 theta. Now I'll put it all together. Don't forget, it's always important to find the midline first. So this one, the midline is right here. It's already kind of marked on it, but the midline is right there. Okay, so I want to find A. Oh, first I want to see if it's cosine or sine. And it's cosine because it doesn't start on the midline. And it's positive because it starts at the max. And that looks like 1, 2, 3 units, so A is positive 3. And we know it's cosine. Now we need to get B. So what's the period? 0, max, midline, min, midline, max. And that's at 3 pi over 2. So we do 3 pi over 2 equals 2 pi over B. Now we need to solve that. Darn it. Okay, so cross multiply. So we have 3 pi ugh, 3 pi times B equals 4 pi. Well, the pi's are going to cancel out. So 3b equals 4. Did I do this right? 3 pi over 2 equals 2 pi over b. Pi's cross out, so we have 3 over 2. No, I did it right. 3b equals 4 pi, so 4, so b is 4/3. So then the midline is y equals, k is going to be 1. So to write this out, we're going to write y equals, a is 3, it's cosine, b is 4/3 theta, plus k, which was 1, plus, I need to buy a new, this thing's terrible. So that should say 3 cosine 4/3 theta, that should be theta, plus 1. Okay, so turn off the video, or stop the video, try this problem, and come back. Alright, so finding the midline. You can see the midline is right here. So k is positive 1. It looks like this is cosine because it starts at negative 1. So a is going to be negative, and it's going to be 2, right? Because it's 2 units away. A is negative 2, and it's cosine. So the period, min, midline, max, midline, min. Period is 2 pi. We already know that makes b equal 1. So y equals negative 2 cosine theta plus 1. Okay, so your practice for this exercise is in Delta Math. You're going to practice finding midline, amplitude, and period. Then you're going to put it all together and practice doing writing the equations. You only have to get 5 correct answers in each section, and I set it up so it doesn't minus every time you miss one. So, and please feel free to take advantage of the videos they put in there. I think he did that for free because of the COVID-19 deal, but they're pretty good if you get stuck. So let me know if I can be any help. After you do those, then you will have the lesson quiz, and I'll do a mini assessment on the end of this unit. I'll probably have that ready by the end of the week. So just let me know if I can help you with anything.